My name is Michael Boland. I'm the Chief of Park Development and Visitor Engagement with the Presidio Trust. The Presidio Trust is a single-purpose federal agency. We were created by the United States Congress in 1996. And we really exist for one reason, which is to transform the Presidio into a national park that is financially self-sufficient. So we operate with no federal funding. We get no appropriated funds. We have to generate all of the revenue we need each year to be able to support the ongoing transformation and operation of the Presidio. Yeah, several years ago I was invited to participate in a charrette that was focused on the future of Yongsan Army Base in Seoul. A group of us were invited to come and we participated in a couple-day symposium where we talked about the potential transformation of Yongsan and its potential to serve the community of Seoul as a park. And I think, I was invited very much because of my experience here in the Presidio in stewarding the transformation of the Presidio, which is a former Army base, into a national park site that serves not only international and national visitors, but everyone across our community. Because the Presidio is an urban national park, we're very much focused on how we can serve local communities, particularly youth and families that otherwise might not get to a national park. People that live in our cities that don't have the ability, they don't have the time or the money or the way to get out to the more remote national parks in the United States. So urban national parks like the Presidio and the Golden Gate National Recreation Area were created to bring national park experiences to urban communities. The Presidio, very much like Yongsan, has many buildings, but it also is surrounded by many vibrant neighborhoods. And cities like Seoul, like cities all over the world, are dramatically and rapidly urbanizing. There's an incredible growth in the number of people living in cities around the world. I heard in Seoul as well, and there's a lot of development going on in the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the Army base. And as cities get to be more and more dense, what's become clear is that people need access to nature. Many people grow up, like I did, out in the country. They grow up surrounded by nature, surrounded by open space. And then they move into the city and they feel overwhelmed by the noise, by the density, by the activity. And so large urban parks like the Presidio serve a really important purpose because they are large enough that they allow you to get away from the city. So the first thing I said to our hosts in Seoul really had to do with the size of the base, that the base is quite large and that it's large enough to do a couple of things. That it's large enough to create continuous open space where people can get away from cars, they can get away from traffic, they can get away from noise, and they can have an experience that is really the antithesis of the surrounding city. The second thing is I was really struck by the fact that there is a beautiful park along the river and that Yongsan sits between that park up on the mountain and the park at the river. And that if there was a way to connect those two parks using the space in Yongsan and create this large continuous green space that went from the river up to the top of the mountain and back again, that it would be an incredibly beautiful and a very compelling urban experience for people that live in Seoul. And again, would allow you to really get lost in the park in a way that I think people that live in cities really need. They need the ability to have a place to take refuge from the rigors of urban life. So I'd say those are the two most important things that I communicated about the place. I think the other thing, we talked quite a bit about was our business model. The Presidio Trust we had 15 years to become financially self-sufficient. So each year we were given a declining appropriation by the United States Congress, and we had to spend that money to renovate buildings that we could then lease to private individuals and generate revenue that we put back into the park. So the real estate became a revenue engine that we used to transform the Presidio. It took us about 15 years to become financially self-sufficient. That was the requirement that Congress gave us. The fact is we became financially self-sufficient a couple years early. But this idea of using the assets of the Army base to generate revenue to support the ongoing operations of the park and the ongoing transformation of the park, I think is a model that has potential application in a number of places around the world, and particularly at a landscape like Yongsan that is blessed with so many interesting buildings that could be renovated and leased to generate revenue to support the park. Also, like the Presidio, there are places where there are buildings that are not historically significant, where buildings could be removed to create more open space, and we've done some of that here in the Presidio as well. There have been some buildings down at Chrissy Field and in other areas that are not historic, where we were able to remove the buildings to create more continuous open space. Because there's nothing better than being in a city and being able to go for a long walk or go for a run or go for a bike ride and not have to cross streets and be able to experience nature in a continuous way. So that was another thing that we talked quite a bit about the ability to use, to selectively demolish buildings or selectively add new construction in a way that creates a vibrant public experience. And all of those are ideas that we've used here in the Presidio. I'd say the last thing that we talked about, and this is something we're very interested in, the Presidio has a very deep history, and some of the history is very complicated. Some of the Presidio's history has to do with events in the history of the United States that we look back on as being difficult moments in our history. And what we have tried to do here in the Presidio is to elevate that history, to make sure that everybody is aware of that deep history of this place. So for example, during the Second World War, there was an internment order for Japanese Americans in the United States. And that order was issued in one of the buildings in the Presidio. And as a result of that, Japanese Americans were incarcerated up and down the West Coast. Because that order was issued here in San Francisco and issued in the Presidio, we've developed an exhibit that tells the story of this order and highlights the impact the order had on the lives of tens of thousands of Japanese Americans in our community. We worked with the Japanese American community to actually build the exhibit and to develop programming about that history so that that history isn't forgotten. And I know that Yongsan has a rich and complicated history as well and is a very important site historically. And I think that the approach that we've taken, where we don't shy away from difficult history, but try to elevate it and make it available to the public so that these chapters in our history aren't forgotten, is another idea that has potential application at Yongsan. We were invited to talk about a couple of things. Organizers were very interested in our business model. They were very interested in how we became financially self-sufficient. One of the big challenges in parks all around the world is creating an ongoing funding stream that supports the park in perpetuity, to make sure that parks are well funded, don't depend only on government funding, government subsidy. And so we talked quite a bit about the pathway to that, what our strategies were, and some of the difficulties, some of the challenges. For example, one of the opportunities that we found is we added housing in some of the old buildings in the Presidio, but we've been careful to do it in a way that it doesn't privatize parts of the park so that members of the public don't feel comfortable. And that's a really important consideration. When you have businesses and housing in a park, it's very important that the general public that you're trying to serve by building the park, that you do it in a way that they feel comfortable and they feel welcome. The general public feels welcome. So we talked quite a bit about that, talked about our strategies for gaining public acceptance with the idea of putting businesses in a park more generally. For many people, parks are perceived to be a place that is the antithesis of the city. You know, it's the place that's the opposite of the city. And in some ways, parks really need to be. They need to be quiet and meditative and a place that people can access nature. But it doesn't mean that commercial enterprise can't be in the city and that the revenue that's generated by those enterprises can be used then to support the park. So we talked quite a bit about our business model. We talked a little bit about our strategy for transforming the park, particularly the landscapes. So much of the Presidio was paved. There were unused airfields, concrete airfields down at Chrissy Field. There's a freeway cutting through the center of the park, dividing the park in two. There were old historic landscapes that the Army had paved in the late 20th century to build parking lots. So we talked a bit about how we worked with the community to transform those landscapes, how we worked with our nonprofit partner. We have a nonprofit partner called the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy that raises philanthropic funding that we can then use to transform the park, how we work with the Parks Conservancy to transform the park, how we work with the community to actually engage the community in developing the vision for the park. So we talked quite a bit about that, how you use the residents of nearby neighborhoods and engage them in park transformation through volunteer activity, through workshops, through visioning workshops, how we work with the community to actually help us craft a vision for what the Presidio will be. So we talked quite a bit about that. We talked about what I would call community engagement, this idea that if you want a park to reflect the interests and aspirations of the community, that it's vitally important to engage the community throughout the process of its transformation, and that there are multiple ways. We have here in the Presidio thousands of volunteers each year that come and they do work in the park for us, and they learn about the park, and they help us shape the vision for the park. So they do a number of things that range from helping us restore natural systems, because the Presidio is one of the last remaining natural areas in San Francisco. It has the best, most intact remaining example of San Francisco's native biodiversity. So the community comes and they spend tens of thousands of hours each year helping us restore native ecosystems in the Presidio. They help us with our historic gardens. They help us restore our historic forest. They also help us work with youth and deliver programs. They function as docents and help interpret the Presidio's history, and they help us welcome the public. So they play many roles, but they also help us in an ongoing way imagine what the Presidio can be. And so we learn from them because they're informed constituents. They can help us transform the Presidio and help us be mindful of making sure that the Presidio that we're building, this great national park that we're building, reflects the desires and aspirations and interests of the community. So we talked quite a bit about how to engage community in the transformation of a historic site like the Presidio into a national park site. It's important to think about the logic of a park. You know, we talk about this quite a bit in the Presidio, that the Presidio was developed by the Army to serve one purpose, which was to defend our country. And that means that there are many things that are here that don't really fit into the logic of a park. And so we talked a bit about what is the logic of a park? What kind of park does Yongsan want to be? We talked a little bit about some ideas that might be controversial. Like perhaps there may be parcels of land that are part of the Yongsan Army Base that actually don't have an important role to play in the park, that they could be developed or they could be swapped for some other land that maybe could play a really important role to play. Particularly, I mentioned earlier, this idea of connecting up to that incredible mountain park that we walked through and connecting to the waterfront. It might be that there are ways that you could swap some of the land that is part of the Yongsan Army Base and develop that land and use that to acquire other land that would allow you to create this continuous park experience from that peak all the way to the river. So we talked about some crazy ideas that, you know, potentially would be very controversial. But I think the important thing, one of the things that we've really learned here in the Presidio, is to take a long view. That parks persist for centuries. And so it's really important to step back and have a vision about what this place can be and to take the long view, you know, to ask ourselves as a community, what kind of open spaces do we want to leave, not just for our children, but for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for, you know, generations and generations to come. Because once open spaces in cities are built, it's very hard to get them back. And so it's vitally important to imagine the kind of open space and the kind of community around that open space that will make Seoul a vibrant, exciting, beautiful city for centuries to come. And so that's part of the conversation we had. It's an incredible site that sits in an incredible location in the very heart of the city, and so it's an unsurpassed opportunity to build something truly transformative in the center of the community.